When you wake up every day, struggling to get out of bed and feeling like you want to die, like you don't know what the day will actually look like and whether you'll suffer or suffer more because of that. When you're being able to do what you like, when you're being able to fulfill any hopes like any other people around you because you're limited from the day you are born, these are the sort of emotional and mental distresses that we want to alleviate and prevent as much as possible from this world. Let's start with the basic understanding of what this actually looks like. We think that the machine that we're talking about can know which and assign for each mental health problem a risk score from 1 to 100 in percent y, how likely it is to be. The parents then can decide whether they want this specific, not even embryo, it's before embryo, it's like just an eye with a sperm, whether they want it, or whether they want a search for another, which will be quite fast, considering that each sperm has, there are a lot of sperms, there are a lot of eyes, etc., and then they can decide whether to take it or not to take it. We think that IVF is likely becoming popular with the years. We think that anyway there are still many people who have children in other cases. We'll first explain why we'll have a better life for these people, and secondly, we'll talk about better preparedness. But firstly, it's important to note that there is even no abortion, no killing of anything that is going on. In any IVF that happens, there are already some 20 or 30 potential embryos that are created. We're just choosing from them anyway. So any argument that talks about killing or anything like that is irrelevant in this debate. Even if you oppose abortion, this is not something like abortion. Let's move on. So all of you think that the feeling of dread that that you cannot alleviate, the feeling that you don't know what's around you because you are suffering from schizophrenia and you're literally having fears that you cannot alleviate no matter what. All of these things happen when you have mental health problems. The feeling of seeing the people around you and knowing that they can do things that you cannot, not one or two kids, but all the kids around you. Many times knowing that you are different and feeling guilty because of that, but not being seen still as a major depression, etc., because you're not being diagnosed yet, because there is also a problem of diagnosis in many of these cases. In other cases, we think that the inability to feel independent throughout your life, a thing that is taught to you every time, in every place, how important it is to be independent, to have your own house, to go to your own job, and feeling that all of these things that you have been taught are important, you will never be able to actually get to them because you are in that condition. And we think that yes, some of these conditions are better and some of these conditions are actually worse, but we think that many of them are that worse. And we think that for many of them, the most basic achievements to every one of us, like waking up and going to our job, is a thing that is an incredible sacrifice for them, which almost all the society does not recognize, which they need to work hard on and don't have the happiness and the gratification like everyone else, because they are not seen as those warriors that we are seen, because we are more or less normal. Before I move on, yes. Clarification, right?
Kind of. I'm confused, sorry. Are you forcing everyone to do this, or are you giving them the choice to have the baby?
I was really clear that I was not forcing anyone to do anything. I hope that it will be as common, and who wants to do IVF will do, not forcing anything. Let's move on. We think that all of these things are alleviated by when we are able to choose people who are less likely to have those mental illnesses. Yes, we think that moreover, this is important, it is many times the burden and the feeling that you are burdening your parents, many times seeing your brother, which notice in many IVFs it's more likely to be twins, where one could have mental condition and the other not, specifically seeing the burden you are putting on others, feeling the guilt many times, that although people tell you that it is biological, you feel that you are also at guilt, because people are still angry at you many times, because your mother can also be angry at you, like she's angry at other children, but you feel the guilt of being that way and not being any different. All these burdens, we think, are huge suffering, which we can alleviate. We think that it is the matter of the parents to do that in the more mental cases, schizophrenia, major depression are more likely to happen, maybe others are a bit less, but what's important is that we alleviate so much suffering. Secondly, better preparedness. We think that many parents will take some risks, say, yes, okay, we're okay with, for example, I don't know, 20% of soft depression or higher depression. This is important because the preparedness and the knowledge of the parents that there is a likelihood that is not zero to happen is crucial. Firstly, in the comparative, almost no parent thinks about that really. He doesn't want to think, yes, my child could be autistic or anything like that, my child could be like that. But moreover, this refusal many times leads to the parent not sending his kid to the diagnosis as late as possible because he doesn't want to think of his kid like that. He doesn't want to deal with it like that. This is important because it means that he doesn't know how to deal with it. Many times he causes him emotional distress that isn't necessary because he doesn't know. He explains to him, look, he's smiling at you. Can't you understand that? And that brings only more guilt in that kid. We think that when you actually learn about it, when you have books that learn, when you are not from day one, but when you can diagnose it already at when you're 1 year old and not 6 or at 10 years old, which is literally what for many mental illnesses happens today. This is a decision between a childhood that cannot be bad and a child that is bad, guilt-ridden by the kid himself and by the parent that's feeling that he has not actually trained him was a good parent. All these things are horrible to the continuance of the child in any case, in all cases. But moreover, you're more likely to see as a parent the good side in some of these mental illnesses or some of these problems. Think what I can actually help people with autism, for example, with other people with autism, or specifically develop certain traits that are more likely to happen for people with autism and give them more hope of these things. These things are more likely to happen when you know that from a young age. When you as a parent are not stricken one day by this monstrous saying that no, your child will not have a normal life. Your child is not likely to have his own house, he's not likely to have his own wife or husband. All these things when you strike when he's 5 or when he's 7 are less likely to make you being prepared. In a way, firstly, just because you already planned your life and it plans on you in one day and you're less likely to know what happened. Secondly, just because you have more time before his birth and because you have more time creating a relationship that you understand him, it's more likely that you will nourish him in a positive way. All these things mean that firstly, we alleviate many suffering by causing more children with less health problematic conditions to be born. And those who are born this way are better prepared by their parents to a better life. I call you to propose.
Speaker for those remarks, and I'd welcome the leader of opposition to open up the off-side here.
We good? The first thing I want to be very clear about is that when it comes to IVF, you don't just go and pick another sperm. For a lot of people, it just takes that special one to actually have a baby. For a lot of people, it means that might be their sole chance of becoming parents. Picking another sperm out of the bunch that you have, probably not a viable model for them to say, we're just going to kill that one, proceed to go into the next one. We think that this means then that as a result, the characterization they give about people just picking that they should get, that should alleviate the future child from that pain doesn't stand. And it means that a lot of people are in fact going to choose to have that child in this world. We're going to explain why that child is going to be detrimentally affected in 3 ways. Firstly, impact on parents. What are the parenting going to look like? They see over-prepared. We say you're going to try and protect your special one every single day. Secondly, we're going to talk about child and how it is impacted, self-fulfilling prophecy, self-diagnosis, treatment, why all that is bad. Thirdly, parent-child relationship. We're covering all our bases. Before that, however, I want to be very clear about one thing. Every single impact that you hear in this speech, it will not be about people who basically alleviate the children from that future. But it is going to be benefited and fundamentally impacted further by the fact that a lot of people, based on their own prioritization, i.e. 3 minutes about how people are going to get rid of them, basically means that the mental health perspective that society has and the people that end up keeping their babies are going to have within society. Because notice, a lot of the stuff they say is confusing. On the one hand, a lot of society is actually choosing not to have the baby, and the rest of the society is going out marching, preaching for autism awareness and looking for further treatments. I think that this cannot really coexist. They have to pick either one, but we're fine with either, honestly. But we think that if people start going on and choosing the first one, which is what presumably they've ranted about, the benefits, the harm to the children that are eventually born with mental health issues are huge. So, what is it about the child how are the parents impacted? The first thing they say, and actually in fact probably it's half a minute analysis, It's like, oh, the parent is going to be a bit more prepared because they know what they're going to have to deal with. I'm not sure why that is true, right? You're going to be more prepared thinking that you're going to have a child that has a mental health issue. That doesn't translate into you being prepared to raise a child that has a mental health issue. In fact, for individuals that are struggling to have babies, and due to that special one, not the Mourinho, the other one, treatment and characterization that individuals generally have, I think that then that baby is actually going to be protected. For all those reasons, i.e. the IVF framework, it is why all those impacts are exacerbated. Because of the fact that this child took you so long to actually get. Exactly because of the fact that you love it unconditionally and chose, independent of that screening, to actually have that child. And all that means that then you're going to try and protect that child at all costs. What does that mean and what does it look like? They say preparedness. What does preparedness look like? I don't know. It might mean you bubble wrap the child and you throw it outside. Like, I don't know. I think that basically what they have to explain is how the parent is going to treat the child. What do we think that looks like? We think it looks like, for example, fact, we don't know if, how, when that mental health issue is going to manifest itself. From the moment the child is born, the parents, based on their own characterization, are going to be prepared for the child, for that child having a mental health issue. We think that then leads to them fucking it up for a lot of reasons. The first one is they're going to be protective. What overprotective? What does that look like? It looks like getting the child to join therapy from a very early age. It looks like the child being in, for example, go for it.
So if you're likely to develop severe depression or severe anxiety, is it not a good thing for me to be put in therapy when I'm younger before the symptoms spiral over time?
Yeah, but you don't have the condition for the symptoms to actually be alleviated. You're taking someone and putting them somewhere and telling them, you're about to have something. Let's prepare you for that something. What does that look like? What does therapy look like in your world for these children? I'm really not sure. But it also looks like analyzing everything that the child does. When I was in kindergarten, I painted a black Christmas tree. And everyone told me I was a psycho because of the fact that it showed some kind of depression on my behalf. No, the answer was simple. I painted Batman's Christmas tree. But the fact that everyone was preoccupied by the fact that I was being weird in class meant that everyone thought that something was wrong with me. That's what it looks like. It looks like the child doing something and that something being blown out of proportion because you're already biased, which they call prepared, we call biased, about the fact that you're going to develop a mental health condition. But it also looks like, for example, misdiagnosis. You might have something else. You might just have a problem that is not related to that, but you rationalize it based on that initial screening that you had from that doctor. Notice, this is important for uneducated parents because these are the people that are actually going to be impacted the most. The widespread and hopes motion that these guys are defending, in fact, means that it's probably going to be government-backed. It means that it's going to be something that's going to be the norm. That means that people who otherwise wouldn't do the screening are going to end up doing it. Why is that bad? Because the people that normally would do it, i.e. are comparative, are people that are already educated, probably want to be cautious about their child, etc. But on their side of the house, you get everyone doing it and hoping that everyone does it, whatever the hell that means in emotion. Okay. And then that means that everyone ends up doing it independent of their background, independent of whether or not they wanted to, independent of whether or not they can understand it, which is a prerequisite for the success of everything that they've said. So notice that then effectively what that means is that you can get two things. For example, you might have parents who refuse to accept the fact that their child has an issue. We were talking about it in prep. We said like a Balkan father who's sitting there with like a couple of beers is going to go like, what the fuck, the kid is fine. And I think that this is going to a lot of the time look like that and basically not get treatment for that individual. And because of the fact, and that is the delta, because I know the POI here is going to be, that's symmetrical, that they become defensive exactly of that screening that you guys are forcing them to do. Or then, too much actively protecting that individual and effectively not letting the child have a normal life. Impact on the child. First thing I want to note is that, for example, this can become a lot of the time a self-fulfilling prophecy. For instance, it can in three ways. The first one is that, and I'm going to do this with an example, it's going to run throughout. If you can't focus at school and your screening, if you can't focus at school and your screening said that you are, for example, preoccupied to have ADHD or something, people are going to say that, well, this individual has been screened for ADHD. What can that look like? It can look like self-victimization on behalf of the child, like, that's my issue, I'm the victim here, I have ADHD. It can look like self-diagnosis of, again, saying, I have ADHD, here's what I should strive to do, here's the medication, etc., which can be pretty fucked up if you take the wrong meds for something that you don't have, just because of the screening. But it also can lead to misdiagnosis, because there's something like, this is like a very light scenario, but you just might not be paying attention in fucking class. And that is something that you shouldn't be able to rationalize based on a screening that happened at some point in time. Then secondly, and I want to, and this is kind of like, but kids talk about this stuff. If this becomes so widespread, I'm pretty sure that kids are going to try and talk about whether or not their screening happened, etc. I'm thinking that individuals are going to, this is something that's going to be entering the mainstream in society. But lastly, parent-child relationship. 3 scenarios. Firstly, you despise your parents from bringing you in this world if they choose to bring you in this world, independent of the fact that you were getting screened and that was seen there. Secondly, they become control freaks. Or thirdly, you don't even come into this world, which these guys seem to be okay with. We are not, because a lot of the time people have sex and they manage to actually have babies, and those babies can have mental health issues, and we're gonna be looking at them like they're weird because of the fact that these guys are just killing them endlessly. So for all those reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the DP on here.
Okay, yeah. Am I good to start? I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, a characterization of how IVF works, in which cases this is going to apply to. Secondly, about how we are better for the development of children and the parent-child relationship. And then finally, I'm going to weigh future medical innovations and the societal implications of this. Let's start by going into the first thing of when is this going to happen, because opening opposition clearly does not understand IVF when they literally say that there's only going to be one fertilized egg that's an option. This is simply nonsense, right? The average cycle fertilizes in an average of 30, often about 6 will end up sticking, and you can have repeated cycles. Even if one cycle wields everyone, where everyone in that cycle happens to be mentally ill, you're then able to do another round of IVF in the hopes of having a different outcome that's going to exist. And sure, maybe the majority of these embryos aren't going to be viable, and there's 3 or 4 eggs, and all of them are somewhere on the spectrum of having the risk of mental illness. At least in these cases, you are able to distinguish between 2 factors. Firstly, who is less mentally ill, so it's unlikely that the risk factor is going to be the exact same across all levels of the fertilized eggs, such that you can pick someone who's going to have a comparatively better quality of life. And B, the screening is likely to be detailed enough to show the kind of mental illness that you are at risk for, given that depression and schizophrenia and anxiety impact different areas of the brain. So if you are a parent, for example, who knows that I was an addict, I'm going to really trigger my child if they happen to have the predisposition to develop forms of addiction, I can then select for a mental illness, which is something that is going to be less triggering for me, that I'm better equipped to deal with. There's currently more resources towards, there still are ways to engage in the harm mitigation process. If their claim is true that literally this debate is only about one potential fertilized egg, that should be the parent's choice, right? It's a massive burden to take on raising a child, and if you feel like you cannot adequately care for them because of your own mental illness, you should ultimately be able to do that. We also don't think that life is inherently utility positive or a good thing. If every single day of your life, and I'm sorry to be triggering here, you literally want to die, and many of us love someone who has depression or has experienced this herself, I can promise you that this is not a good life or a life that people want to live. If you cannot leave the house because of crippling anxiety, we say it is far better to spare these people from the pain, and we are willing to accept the comparative of non-existence in certain circumstances, although the far more likely comparative is choosing a child who's going to have a better quality of existence, a lower degree of mental illness, or someone who is ultimately neurotypical. The next thing that I want to talk about is how this is going to impact the parent-child relationship. The first claim that I want to refute is that this is going to cause parents to become really overly protective of their children. We would say that the opposite is actually likely to happen because certainty is better under our side of the house. That if my child is acting out, I know they have ADHD, and I know that there is a solution to this if they are able to organize themselves better, and if they're able to start a medication regimen, like taking Ritalin, like I get to be able to focus in debates. What happens in their world? Your child starts acting out and being confusing, but you are not aware of the cause of why they are doing that, right? Is it this group of friends that's being bad? Are they on drugs? Are they having random behavioral issues? Are they being exposed to negative influences in video games? So the more uncertain you are over over the causes of that bad behavior, the more likely that you are actually going to be to overreact and restrict their liberties rather than to engage in targeted interventions on your side of the house. Secondly, even if you don't buy this, parents just know that if you try and be like super restrictive of your kids, that's probably going to be backfire. Like if your response is literally to never allow your child to leave the house and you see that that child's starting to rebel, there are internal self-correcting mechanisms within your own parenting where you are probably going to adapt the kind of things that you are doing in accordance with what is actually going to help your child. The next thing that we hear is that there might be a self-fulfilling prophecy over mental illness. I know that the Balkans sometimes don't take mental illness as seriously as they should. It is not a self-fulfilling prophecy if you are born with the mental illness, right? Like what these tests are saying is that you are very likely to develop this when you get older. When you start showing symptoms of this, what happens, right? If you are like, oh, maybe my child has ADHD, when the test said there's an 80% chance you have ADHD, they probably get outsourced to a specialist to still get technically diagnosed. In the event that you are wrong, the specialist can tell you that you are wrong, but sure, let this happen. Let's empower these kids to get the help that they actually deserve. The final thing that we hear on this class is that you're likely to resent your parents for bringing you into the world if you are mentally ill. Firstly, I don't think that this is information that you as a parent necessarily have to tell your child. Like you could just say that, oh, like, you didn't even come from IVF. Like, you can just pretend that there was no other embryo that was ultimately better for you. But I think that this is a bit strange, right? Like, you can often have these conversations in a meaningful way. Like, it was always my dream to have a child. There's a lot of things in your life that are ultimately valuable for you. Like, the other options for me were worse. So especially as we age, you can have these conversations, and parents can ultimately decide the extent of information that they want to reveal, as often happens with cases of adoption. What is our flip under the parent-child relationship, right? Because it was ridiculous for them to say, what does early intervention actually look like? Firstly, medication to spare people of horrible childhoods. Just being told that I'm dumb, that I cannot focus in class because I was unmedicated. Children who have schizophrenia just thinking that they're going insane and isolating themselves when there was a simple cure that was going to help them. Secondly, therapy and early interventions. Most mental illnesses involve a combination of nature and of nurture, right? When you know that there is a risk of them developing, you can do things to help the nature side of it. Things like early therapy are actively a good thing for these children, because if you are being bullied, which is a trigger which can cause more severe depression, because there's varying severities that these things can exist in, we're more likely to actually attack the roots of these issues. So for people who would be mentally ill regardless, we're more likely to prevent these problems from spiraling when we actually attack them when people are younger. Before I talk about long-term implications, I'll take back half, top half.
So when these people are diagnosed, then you can do all of that. The issue is that what we told you, instead of saying your kid is making a fuss, they have ADHD, let's give them some Ritalin. A lot of the time people are just going to be, well, let's start because we know of the likelihood, as we explained before.
But why would you treat a mental illness before it exists? Like, that's just stupid. You go to, there's medical systems that exist on your both sides of the house, right? There's often side effects of these things, so you send them to the system, you get them processed. On the social implications of this, they say that there might be bad narratives surrounding mental illness, right? We abort people with Down syndrome and allow screaming of this in abortions right now. Do we go around in society thinking that people with Down syndrome do not deserve to be alive or we hate them? There's obviously nuance of how this can be portrayed, and if anything, what it tells people is that it's really, really shitty to be born with depression or anxiety or schizophrenia. It's so shitty that for some people this life is not worth it. Maybe we should take people seriously when they say, I need sick leave because I'm too depressed to get out of my bed. So really what it highlights is the urgency of solving these situations. On things like medical innovation though, I think that there's actually a new group of research that opens up under our side of the house because you functionally create a very large mass of test cases. Some parents will have all of their embryos that will have high degrees of predisposition for mental illness. Some parents will have none. So what this does is that you can compare the brain scans of parents who have a lot of embryos with large risk factors and brain scans of parents who have fewer risk factors in order to better understand the physiological roots of mental illness and therefore develop new treatments. We can also track kids as well and the varying severities that stem from their initial likelihoods to better understand these things, so we actually get more knowledge and information under our side of the house. Very Protestant opening government.
I thank the speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the DLO to close up the top half. Here.
Okay, ready? My mother tried for 10 years to have another child. You cannot imagine what he's going through, somebody like that in their right mind, trying everything, doing to all of the things, and still being completely unacceptable to even conceive a child. This is the reality that these parents go through. You don't go to this program because you just decided to do so. You go to this program after a period of trying to have a child, after failing miserably, after this has impacted your relationships throughout your whole lives and things like that. The reality is that most of the parents are not able to conceive, or at least when they're able to through this process, it's a very rare occasion on itself, which means that probably it's a much difficult choice than they present it to be. And this, I just regret that we are able to intellectualize this whole human experience into we're just going to select for the right amount of babies. We're gonna select a child who is prone to this condition because it fits very well with our precondition and things like that. This is not the reality of that these people are actually living through. And some of these people are gonna have this baby either way for religious reasons or just because, I don't know, they don't want to gamble with their child's lives in these particular cases because just they don't want to have a family. They want to have a kid, and that's all they really care about in these particular senses. So this whole idea of self-selection is complete bullshit. It's not a reality that we're living for, first and foremost. Second thing on the relationships. This whole argument is kind of like, oh, certainty is better because now you know because your kid is acting out. Completely bullshit, right? Why? Because only thing that you get as information is probability. It's a risk factor. They themselves said it could be 10%, could be 20%, could be 30%, could be even 90%. There is no certainty in any of this that this child actually has this. So it is completely fair from us to point out that there are going to be multiple situations where they think you have something because you have the risk for it, but you don't actually have it. So they have to engage with these particular cases as much as the other particular cases where you do have, in fact, have the particular conditions. In many of the cases, it's also about perception. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, but there's a lot of things that you think that oh my God, there's 20%, I have to get him through 10 therapists until he was the age of 5. Imagine that traumatic experience where there is nothing wrong to you, but since the age of 3 or 5, you've been going to tens and thousands of therapists. I think when we compare these things with somebody who on our side of the house maybe gets a little bit later into therapy, but it's their choice, it's on their terms, and their ability to actually choose this particular option, it's much better and much more effective, even if it's a little bit later in their life that they actually make the decision to go to therapy in the first place, or their parents help them in this particular sense. So on that comparative in these scenarios, we think it's better to not traumatize the people who don't have anything in their life, and actually for the other people, we will still have a good chance for them to getting the help that they need or the medication that they need and things like that. So I reject this premise as well. Finally, I think this is also important. This whole 10-second analysis of how this is gonna do innovation, I'm just gonna say it. I think this is beyond the average intelligent voter abilities. We don't have no information. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not really sure how you're going to be able to use these particular scans. It is beyond the knowledge of this round. You don't have to account for it. Even if Naomi is on the bridge of winning the Nobel Prize for her innovative experience in this particular debate. Look, the other thing that they say is, oh, but you're not gonna send your kid to actually get help. And I think this is important. First of all, the likelihood of the parents sending their kid to get help is entirely dependent on the parent themselves. They don't actually analyze what is the likely parent because they can't, because parents are different and people are different. They come from different cultures, different countries, different conditions. Maybe they had somebody in their life that had this, maybe they have another predispositions. We just don't know. So I've actually done the job for you. There are generally two parents. The progressive ones who are gonna give you the treatment anyway, and all of these things, and the parents who are gonna deny that this exists, or they're gonna say it's not that big of a deal, or they have full stigma on mode on mental health beings. Why do we win in those two cases? Firstly, because in both cases, in the risks that it turns out that this is going to be false, on our side, this was never a burden, it did not impact your relationship, they did not overprotect you, then they did not traumatize you through therapy, we win on both cases. If your parents are progressive, we also win, because if they don't know shit about this, but they still see and they have your best interest as mind to realize, hey, my kid is kind of isolated, hey, my kid is not doing well at school, they have already the incentive to, get you to the right therapy because they're progressive and they're educated and they understand that these things will help you. So in those cases, we also already win on both sides, even if they don't have this information in the first place. In the second situation, where you have parents who are like the bad parents, who are not thinking of mental health, I think you're seen already as broken, you're seen as special, you're seen as somebody who cannot live their own life on their own, and the overprotection exhibits in a much more dramatic way in these situations. I prefer, comparatively, for you to find out on your own that you might have these conditions and preserve your self-agency to decide whether you want to tell your parents that you have these conditions or not. We think this agency weighs much higher than maybe your parents helping you or not helping you. In this case, they won't help because they're bad parents. So all of the scenarios come on our side of the house in terms of probability in this particular analysis. Finally, for the parents, and they start with this, who never have the child, think about this experience. You are now even more guilty that you didn't decide to have the child in the first place, and already explained that the probability of conceiving again is very minimal in certain situations. In a lot of the situations, that's why you're using IVF in the first place. But think of the guilt that you're feeling. It was literally my fault that my child is broken, that they have 50% risk factor of ADHD. Think of the guilt on the other side, where this precludes you for having that child, and then for the rest of your life, you regret that you never had that child in the first place. You regret it every moment that when you're in your old bed, when everything else, it doesn't matter, that maybe that child would have been normal, and maybe you could have loved him as much as anybody else. Thank you very much.
I think that's super for those remarks, and I welcome the member of government to open up the bottom line.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it sucks to be me, but it sucks worse to be my mother because my mother is constantly stressing about me, my mother has to subsidize me, and my mother feels blame because the issues I have, I got from her. We're going to talk about harm to parents, about the cost, the responsibility, having children who stay children forever, and how this ruins all of your other connections, leading to massive self-blame. We're going to show by far the biggest impact on parents. Amitai will have lots of weighing. I'll also talk about why unhealthy parents in particular need to have healthy kids. First, a bit of framing. In what cases is our case relevant? It's relevant for severe physical disabilities like cerebral palsy, for severe neurodivergences like low-functioning autism, for severe mental health disorders like bipolar or major depression, for severe physical health issues like immunodeficiencies or cancerous. Some people who have these issues suffer until they kill themselves. Some people suffer until they die of old age. Some people are so mentally disabled, they aren't even aware enough to suffer, but their parents have to be there non-stop from the moment they're born till the moment one of these people dies, and this ruins those parents' lives. Let's talk about harm to parents, starting with the huge cost. Now, I want to preempt because some countries may have mostly funded healthcare, and I admit that that the cost isn't as severe if you live in Germany, but most of the world lacks free healthcare, and even where it exists, there's long lines, less qualified doctors than in private care, limited coverage for complex treatments or expensive machinery or medication. So let's talk about this cost. It looks first like special equipment, needing to make your home wheelchair accessible, and buy an electric wheelchair. You need a big house, a big bathroom. You have to have fancy electric machinery within your house. It helps people breathe if they struggle to breathe themselves later. Second, treatment and doctors. These diseases are considered complex and severe specifically because we haven't yet solved them. There are few experts qualified to treat them who are aware of the cutting edge research. There are few and expensive treatments that work to some extent. Maybe they work, but you have to do them every day of the week or every month until the day you die. Maybe they work, but you have to try 10 different ones until one of them may be worse. Maybe they work, but only as mitigations and you have to use many of them. But beyond the treatment, it's also about special care. It's often constant. Many of these people are unable to exist alone. They cannot feed themselves. They cannot walk themselves. That means that you have to have a parent staying at home, meaning you live on a one-income salary instead of two, or you have to pay for constant care, which is just as expensive as living on a single income salary. What are the impacts of this? Any child is expensive. And we live in an era where most parents are stressed for cash. Many families live month to month and rent instead of owning their house. But this child, for the average parent, is economically impossible to sustain. It guarantees a life of poverty, of overworking and exhaustion, of austerity and of begging for support from the state, from family members, and from charities. It comes at the expense of anything else in life that requires money, like owning a home and feeling house secure, like owning a car or funding your hobbies and vacations, or not having to take on a second or third job. But beyond the cost in money, there's a cost in responsibility. These kids are a time sink, an energy sink, and a worry sink. Every morning getting ready takes longer. Every night making dinner takes longer. Putting them to bed takes longer. Taking them from school takes longer. They can't entertain themselves, which means that you have to constantly be worried about who's with them. How are they doing? Are they okay? Do they need my support? And if you're not with them, you feel guilt because you're so accustomed to being a caretaker parent that you are constantly worried that you're not fulfilling your responsibility to them. Now, they're also fully dependent on you. You can't afford to have a bad day, to be depressed and dysfunctional, to have low patience. You can't be angry at your low-functioning autistic child because they could be traumatized for life by you yelling at them. You can't afford taking a vacation or even just, going to a hotel for a night because the parents want some time away from the kids, because you can't afford to leave this teenager alone, and you can't afford to take them with you because of their accessibility needs. The impact of this is that you lose your autonomy. You lose the ability to choose what to do and when you do it and how you do it. And you don't get any opt-out of this ever. You have no way of giving up on this responsibility. It's not like a job that you can just quit. Do you have a PR for me?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
If this is your preference, just give the kid for adoption.
No one is going to adopt a kid who is 3 years old and severely ill. This is absurd. Let's talk about forever children, because these issues are not treatable. Someone who has an immunodeficiency and can't leave the house can never leave the house. Someone who has the mental age of a 5-year-old will always have that mental age, which means that your responsibility for them goes until death and beyond, because if you die before they do on your deathbed, you feel terrible guilt and blame for abandoning them to live alone. The same thing is true for cost. The financial cost is also forever. The impact of this is that instead of having to be responsible for a child for roughly 15 years before they move out, they're mostly independent, and then you can have more chapters of your life, you can divorce and get remarried, you can travel the world, you can try a new career. You can't do any of that. You are a parent for life. This also means you don't get to rely on your children in old age. Your children are never going to subsidize you when you're in pension, when you've gone into pension and you don't have enough money to feed yourself. They're never going to help you deal with your illnesses in old age, or with your grief when you lose your partner, or dealing with bureaucracy of the state. But fourth, this comes at the expense of other connections and relationships. The most important harm is to your other children, because you either don't have them, or you neglect them, or you even abuse them, i.e. donor siblings. So not having them means you're now too busy to afford them. You're now too poor to afford them. You know that you're not going to be able to give them the life that they deserve and need. But if you have them, let's say you already have older siblings. You know how every older sibling hates when they have a younger sibling and they have to split their parents' attention? Well, now it's not about splitting. You lost your parents' attention, because even if you're 5 years old, you are incredibly independent and capable. You are forced to to grow up and mature incredibly early, and you don't have the attention, care, focus, or money that you deserve to have from your parents in order to have a good life. But they could even abuse them. This looks like telling a 10-year-old that they need to stay at home after school every day and not hang out with friends or go to after-school activities because the parents are at work and this kid has to take care of their younger sibling. It looks like having donor siblings in order to help a kid who has immunodeficiencies or cancers and is going to need blood transfusions or the spinal fluid transfusions for the rest of their life. But it also creates loads of stress on a marriage. Shared responsibility always leads to conflict over how much each side fulfills their own responsibility. This looks like couples fighting over who's going to wake up to take care of the crying baby, who's going to do the dishes and do the laundry. But this is so much worse because this responsibility is so overbearing, because it's so constant, because you feel so much guilt and blame whenever the child is left alone. This causes tons of stress and tension on the marriage, but you might not even feel like you're able to resolve it. You don't have the money or the time to go to counseling, and you don't have the capacity to divorce because you are now co-parents to this disabled child. Sometimes one parent leaves and the other parent is left abandoned alone to take care of this kid. Finally, it harms other relationships. It's harder to maintain contact with friends who are parents of normal kids because your kid conflicts with those kids. It's hard to go to family events when you always have accessibility needs and you're like, can we please not yell? Everything I told you, you feel it's your fault. You feel inadequate. You feel intolerant. You feel that you're to blame for inheriting this condition to this kid and being unable to give them a better life. This means you will suffer until the day you die. Amitai is going to weigh this. For all of these reasons, go with closing arguments.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the opposite. Here.
Thank you. Sorry for asking you to go back. I'm so tired.
Closing a position is going to take governments on the best case, the case in which you have a child with a low probability of mental illness, that you get the really better child from this polygenic screening, and show why it's still very bad for that child that you have done this screening, but there's massive harm to the parent-child relationship in those cases, when there is no illness to start with, when there is no high-risk illness, and why this is massively impactful over there. But before that, a few direct rebuttals to what we just heard from closing government. Note, on the most basic level, the cases they speak of are incredibly rare. Look, most people do not have cerebral palsy. This is extremely unlikely. They're talking about a tiny minority of the population. Second, for many of those problems, we already allow abortion, right? For Down syndrome, we allow abortion. For the most extreme cases, there are going to be screening during pregnancy that happens on both sides of the house, and there's going to be abortion for most extreme cases. Finally, even in most states, even in extreme states, in poor states, there's usually institutions for those types of children, for people who can't care for themselves at all, to allow them to be hospitalized full time, to allow them to get hospice care. And I'm sorry, but the thing that's happened, it's sad it happens, but many parents actually don't take care of those children because they're incapable of taking care of the children, and we think this is okay, and we think we should live in the reality that it happens. Finally, note, many of the times there will be charities subsidizing and helping providing care for those children as well, so it rarely falls entirely on the parents if they don't choose for it to fall entirely on the parents. Look, we think that it's important to note that almost every child has some degree of mental problems. They're not inborn mental problems. They're developed by society because society is far from perfect. Look, and we know OG said there is some amount of element of nurture in that as well. I think it's much greater than that. Almost every child suffers with some amount of trauma, with some amount of distress. If it's from school and tests, if it's the parents having a divorce, if it's later in life when he does drugs as a teenager, if he's exposed to terrible things in his neighborhood, right? Almost everybody is exposed to some degree of that. And even if you're not categorically a mentally ill kid, you're still going to have some amount of problems. You're still going to have some amount of mental problems you have to deal with and to be able to live with and be able to get over of them. On a second level, we think that some of them will actually develop mental health problems, so that despite the fact that there is no genetic component to them whatsoever, you can develop mental health problems without a genetic component, just from a nurture component. They significantly impact how this debate happens. Look what that actually does to the child. At that point in which the child is in this situation, the parents know that they are solely to blame, uniquely to blame for every health problem the child has, because look, we've screened them, yet 0.02% of depression. It was not likely to happen. No, you analyze the opposite case, in which there is still a child and they're overdiagnosing him. We're telling you, look, let's say he's correctly diagnosed. There is no problem. The diagnosis is correct. They're going to the doctor correctly. Everything is great. right? You're not doing anything specifically wrong. The problem is that they're uniquely to blame. And the problem is not only that they're uniquely to blame, it's that everybody around them knows they're uniquely to blame. Look, an IVF is a long and complicated process. Your parents probably knew you were doing it. Your friends probably knew you were doing it. Your community knew you were doing it. And they knew you've done the screening. A, they expect you to have done the screening because it's the norm in a government's world. But B, you probably shared it with them, that you're lucky that you've got a child that has no mental health care problems. You're lucky your child is fine. And when they see him acting out, they know it's solely your fault, right? There is no element of, okay, it's not only my fault, it's everybody else's fault as well. How does this create a massive backlash for you, right? As a parent, it means that there is emotional weight that is extreme for every step the child takes out of line. It's not like normal child stepping out of line, because you can't say, well, it's just a child, it's just a rowdy child, it's just a problematic child. You have to take full responsibility for that. And you are always afraid of society judging you for that and how you are perceived to be blamed for how the child is behaving and for what he is doing. This has a massive impact. It prevents you from properly interacting with your child. Because every time you take interaction with your child after this has happened the first time, you have a problem that you're thinking, wait, am I doing more damage now, right? I've already done some damage. Am I already to blame? Am I making the situation worse? Am I taking another step down the wrong path? You're questioning every action you can take. That means you can't give the children the most important thing they need from a parent. You can't give them the unconditionality of love. You can't give them the certainty that you know what you need to do. You can't give them the feeling that they can actually go to you and address you and feel hope from you. Before I continue, show opening.
My parents did not get me help for ADHD and depression when I was under the age of 18, not because they weren't progressive, but because they were clueless and they feel huge amounts of guilt. This is larger than the group on your side because most mental illnesses have some degree of biological component.
A, note. On their side, if we take them on their best case, most mental illnesses for the children will not have a biological component. They're actually screening. We take them on the case they want. B, we think it's important to understand that the increasing awareness of mental illness is happening on either side of the house. This is a prospective debate. It's not happening in the past. The more we have ability to understand mental illness and the more knowledge there is of it, the more it becomes widespread, right? Very few people knew about ADHD years ago, and I think in my little brother's class, 60% of them take Ritalin. This is just the reality that we are living in. The illness is increasing on both sides of the house. I don't think they have as much delta there as they claim to have there. Look, we think more than that, it's necessary for the parent-child relationship to be good in order to deal with any mental illness. Note, to a large extent, most treatment of mental illness is about actually trying to take the time and work through it. It's to understand what is the triggers, to understand how to avoid them, how to treat them, how to handle them. And it requires honesty and openness, and it requires you the ability to have some amount of trust and certainty that you're going to get what you need from your parents, right? It's just the feeling of being in a safe space is what helps people deal with depression. It's the feeling of being in a place that's fully secure and having the full certainty that allows people to actually concentrate and get over the significant problems they have in their life. There is no way to do that without the parents actually giving you this sense of comfort that you cannot have if they're blaming themselves for it. But I think on a second level, regardless of how much they're claiming it's going to be impactful, it's going to change the narrative for all other children that are not related to IVF. Because as everybody in this house agrees, most children are not going to be born from IVF. And I know opening opposition said it in one sentence, but they gave you no analysis whatsoever. Look, the key thing to remember is that mental health illness is either way a contentious topic that is massively in the news and being discussed all the time, right? We always have conversations about what accommodation should be given to mental health problems. Are they real? How real are they? What should be done for them? Note that by putting this polygenic screen there and taking a clear stance that this is an important issue that parents should be taking care of, we are giving them something that does not exist in our time. We are giving them a medical consensus, a professional consensus, a statement from the state, from everyone around them that says you are the problem, you are wrong, you have a serious problem that cannot be fixed, you should not be in society, you should not be accommodated. And look, well, this is massive because people will try to actually utilize it against them, right? Everybody right now is objecting to mental health treatments, who thinks we are doing too much, who thinks we should not be making this effort, will say, look, this is wrong, we just shouldn't be in this position in the first place, we should not be accommodating, we should not be taking care of them because they cannot. They have this sense of authority arising from the medical community saying this is wrong and you should not do it. It's going to massively hurt a much greater number of children not born from IVF and having mental illnesses to a great extent because they are now suffering from this impact and they are very likely to be exposed to it, because if you suffer from mental illness, you are likely to follow the mental illness debate, you are likely to be exposed to it, you are likely to be looking at it and following the news and seeing what is happening and what is being discussed. So it's likely that you are actively harming every other child that is born with a mental illness. For all those reasons, we're calling you to oppose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks. I welcome the whip to close out the cup side here.
This will be a simple speech. I will respond to oppositions and then spend a lot of time weighing why the benefit to parents matters to us more than the benefit to children directly. And this will weigh both against OO but also against OG and most of CO. Let's start with direct responses to op-bench. What do CO say? First, more self-blame because nurture is what led to the child being in this place. One, we don't know if nature or nurture are more important. At the very least, we probably know that nature matters to some extent, and it's unlikely that you develop incredibly bad things as part of, only because of nurture. Which means that they probably are talking about a minority of cases of people that would feel this blame if there is no nature component involved in this. Secondly, I also just think that you anyway think that it's your fault. And the reason for this is because we see what we as parents do. We see how we raise the child, the choices that we make. We regret something that we did earlier in the day and we will remember this. But we never see visibly genetic compositions and how much they affect the welfare of the child, which is why there will anyway be a tendency to blame ourselves more for things that happen, and the extent of self-blame at that point becomes unclear. Thirdly, I also think that even if they prove self-blame, we can rationalize self-blame. If you hear enough times your friends and family telling you that it is not necessarily your fault and that there are things that are unavoidable and some people make mistakes in parenting, that might be something that over the long term we can ration out of. What we can't ration out of is the fact that you have to spend money and time with your child, the fact that you know it's hereditary and there's nothing you can do about it and no rationalization can get this out of your mind, the fact that there is no relationship that you can cultivate that makes you happy, this is not something that rationalization will help with. So, then they say something about, I'm hurt by seeing that other people gave up their children. Well, I know my parents aren't those other people. I think that today there are many things that parents do that are abusive. My parents probably just telling me that they're abusive parents and that I shouldn't be affected by this. What do OO say? OO say overprotection. I want to just engage for a second with the premise that they somehow identify but then never analyze of why overprotection doesn't happen on their side. Like if you have a baby, that's probably a point at which you can tell that that they'll have these ailments, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to also see it in a genetic test if it's something that develops over time, which means that the point at which you identify it on their side is when you're hormonal, when you just had the baby, when they're bringing them back from the genetic tests. What is more likely than a reaction of overprotection if you're the most emotionally swayed and the most shocked at that point, and you're so horrified that that's what leads to overprotection. At least on our side, you have time to get desensitized to the idea. Second response, I also just think that on our side, there's more accountability to solve, because you have 9 months or 7 months in which time you know that this child is going to be disabled or that they will have some sort of problem. What happens in that time? There are probably horror stories about people that overprotected their children, that even if you aren't aware of directly, your friends and your family know of. And at the point in which you have yet to have the child, when it's not a comment about your current parenting, when they're not blaming you for doing something wrong, it's much more likely that they tell you about your ideology which you haven't yet implemented, when it still seems legitimate and not an interference on the things that you're actively doing, when you're still likely to take it well because it's not the way that you're currently parenting. That's when we get accountability to the greatest extent. Let's talk about our case and why it's big and beautiful. Let's first of all respond to the attacks that we get. They say, it's not about the most extreme of patients. Well, no one is about the most extreme of patients. All cases are mitigated if it's not the most extreme of patients. OG doesn't prove that life gets so awful because they can still access all sorts of opportunities. OP don't prove that I will overprotect because if it's just ADHD, what the fuck are parents going to do to that extent in order to protect from ADHD? I would actually say that our cases apply more when it's people who are less ill or less severely ill. Because even if it is just a mild form of schizophrenia, even if they're diagnosed just for depression, you as a parent have the catastrophic scenario of your head of what will happen if they decide to cut, of what will happen if they have cerebral palsy, even if it's a very unlikely risk over their life and you are not there. And this catastrophic fear is what makes you still send them to schools that are much more expensive where they can be watched all the time. Still makes you do things like spend all that time with them and having to afford medicine to them that's so expensive. I actually think it applies there. Something about charities, countries that that are in Canada is my response to this. Then they say, but you can just adapt or give it to hospice. I think that you will never do this because you cannot understand what it means to have a disabled child. You've never lived that dependency. What you do feel at the moment where you decide to embrace them are the social pressures and the hormones of loving that child, so you do decide to keep it even if it's irrational. Weighing this over the individual clash. One, I want you to note what OG explains is why life is harder for people with disabilities. Not why it is not worth to live. Maybe I have less opportunities. Maybe I feel guilt by society. But reality check for a second. Most disabled people don't end their life because there's still a joy to experience from this life. But the comparative then is, on our side, it's not a choice between something that might still be good even if less good. It's about parents having the ability to live their life without being hindered to such an extent, without being handicapped in that way, and between the fact that they would otherwise have a life that is much, much worse objectively without some people that would still choose to live. Second way, quantity is important here, and it might sound crude, but the extent of impact that Ayal explained is truly moments of my life, the joy that I lose that's sucked out of me, not being able to spend time with my friends, constantly having to worry about my economic situation. And when you double that, yes, it is a massive impact. Yes, the person suffers on their side, but he doesn't suffer twice as much as people who are constantly worried about every second where they will get their next meal from because of the amount of medical expenses associated. Thirdly, I also think that it leads to their metric of how well the child lives. Because note that if parents are miserable, this is when we take OO at their best. OO say progressive parents will still raise their children well if that's their ideology. And OG never respond to this. We tell you that it's not a question of ideology. If progressive parents are miserable, if they feel strapped, if they are depressed, that's when they can't be there for the child in the way that they are taught, even if they want to. That's when they can't afford in the long run these things that their child might really, really need, which is how we lose out on the accommodation that OO says mitigates OG. Lastly, on reversibility. Luckily, there are ways in which we can accommodate disabled people today directly. There are ways in which we can make life easier for them, normalize things. We can do things like add wheelchairs and things of that sort, which currently exist in some parts of the world. But we think on our side, there is nothing that you can do in order to alleviate the harm of a parent that constantly has to worry about their child, or that has to spend so much time with them at home, or that has to feel this blame. We currently don't have social mechanisms to deal with this other than charities which are way too expensive to actually bear the brunt for the majority of parents. For all those reasons, CG.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I welcome the opposition whip to close out the debate here.
Ready? Okay. I'm starting now. Panel. There are two main questions in this debate, which is the effect of the child and the effect of the parent. Now extension basically wins them both. As such, the thing that we are basically giving to you is how this motion basically changes the way that society perceives mental illnesses to a degree that creates narrative that blames everyone for nurturing instead of nature, which is basically the whole point. Because in essence, when this motion becomes so widespread, it means that you will perfectly eliminate to a vast degree the biological component, or at least the public belief that you eliminate the biological component. It means that your family and friends and such won't be able to support you as a parent because they believe that you are the one who caused the trauma, because you eliminate, especially when to IVF, you eliminate the biological component. It means that when you are born as a child, you get a constant reminder that if you have some kind of a problem into you, it's likely because nurture, not because nature. This is what creates a significant guilt that wasn't engaged at all by the causing government. Now, so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to weigh CG out of the debate in a very significant degree, and then I'm going to basically win on the parents and win on the children, and why this narrative is so harmful for them. So let's start from CG, because again, CG come and say again, we are obviously talking about those very extreme cases. No, we are not. First, they don't explain why you need a widespread a screening of it in order to find the most extreme cases, especially when you have other barriers that we already give you in order to remove this, like the most severe cases. But not only that, even if the effect, and this is like a very small population, less than 1%, all of those together are probably less than 1% of the world population, all of the conditions that they're talking about. As such, what they're saying, where they are having a wider impact, they're saying, no, like in fear, like you are going to be, like we have a fear of this happen. Like, no. Like, when there's no genetic checking of the child, which happens in the side of the house, there won't be fear that the child will develop those instances. As such, but generally, people will not be afraid that the child will be born with those like conditions because it's very unlikely to happen and there's no genetic sign for it to happen in the first place. Not to mention that even if it's so rare, it means that even the genetics will say it's very rare to happen. We are not sure why it is most of the delta. Most of the delta is like in the case of so if it's not happening in more significant cases, it means that the cost that the parent need to pay in all of the lost agency and money, things like that, is very small. Like ADHD doesn't take much in order to get rid of it. So comparatively, our impact simply affects all cases, and as such as much wider likelihood, because it doesn't matter what the degree of your mental illnesses, people will still view it in a stigmatic manner and blame the parents or blame yourself because the parent did, like obviously didn't come from nowhere, he didn't have a genetic, something happened and it's your fault. You took the drugs, you took the alcohol, or your parents were the ones who abused you, something like that, even if they never did. This narrative pushes you and harms you. Before I continue,
yeah, so OG's comparative is not non-existent. It is choosing another egg who is going to develop into a genetically similar person, but not suffer from suicidal ideation and crippling anxiety. This is way bigger impact than minor guilt.
No, like, in the terms of, like, we are not talking, like, I'm going to get to your case later, but like, why the point of suffering is simply uncomparative and not really important in this debate. So, what exactly our narrative does? It does, I said, two main ways. The first is, like, again, the tremendous impact on the parents who will constantly be blamed once they have children with mental illness, which becomes more and more common because we have social factors that cause it. More use of drugs, like society creates isolation, depression, people who don't have enough community. This is something that always happens, and as such is more likely to happen. Not only that, we actually show the significant reinforcement on the stigma on the children whether not being born from IVF or not, which is why we have like a much wider impact. So by likelihood, we win this clash. Now, let's go to the point about, let's talk about the parents. Like, let's do a rebuttal to the point that I'm saying we can just have another child. Let's solve it through rebuttals, only through rebuttals, it's not a new case. Because what they basically say, well, you have dozens of them, you can choose, etc., etc., etc. Let's take into account it's like a genetic factor, so you're likely to have most of those fertilizations to have a genetic component. Second, it's those people have like problems with the fertilization. This is why you have a lot of embryos in the first place. As such, simply by doing rebuttal, we think that the ability to just produce another child is very unlikely. So you have like a lot of problems, so you have a lot of stress on those parents. So we think that you can simply replace them. Now, let's give more like direct cases. So this is an external rebuttal. Let's get it to our case. Because what we actually came from OG. OG come and say, look, we save children for, They come and say, look, the parents will be more prepared for those instances and they shall be able to withstand those issues. Most of the light issues like ADHD, etc., are very commonly treated in the status quo. Like most of the conditions like treatment, you can have a therapist, you have medications, you have so many issues that you think that you have. I have OCD, I don't need to kill myself, I don't think or want to kill myself on a very daily basis. So it's like in very young age, you only notice those behaviors once you start their development. And most countries, regardless of system, have a way to track their development and say the person has autism, etc., etc. So it's like you will have early diagnosis in both sides of the house because while the child will not communicate properly with the parents, you will notice it. So we don't think there's much impact in terms of early diagnosis. In terms of harder conditions, the journey develop on a very late age through triggers, so you can't be prepared for them. So the whole point about the parent will be more prepared is less important. Now, in terms of we have all come and say, look, overprotection is the most important thing in this debate. They think that the mechanism is not that likely because according to their own analysis and constitution, those parents really try to give those children to the world. If you actually believe in them, it's very those parents are likely to be overprotective anyway because after tens or dozens of attempts, finally they have one child, they're likely to be overprotective about them regardless of their mental issue. So we're not sure what is the delta in overprotection compared to us who actually show you a delta in terms of how the guilt is likely to cause that as a narrative is actually going to reinforce both from the society towards the child and towards the parent a very terrible stigma. Now, let's talk about the case of suffering that we're getting from OG in terms of the child itself. Because Mental illnesses everything is very likely to be treatable to a certain degree. You can be regulated. Most people with depression don't want to kill themselves every single day. However, so if it's manageable, it mitigates a lot of their delta while it doesn't want to give up. However, we also remember that there are numerous reasons for suffering regardless, even not mental illnesses. Like according to their own mechanism, people who are poor shouldn't be born. People who are have some issues in life or problematic parents shouldn't be born. Minorities will have hard life, they shouldn't be born. So this means that a lot of their cases are very extreme and we're not sure why most people will simply suffer to this degree. So the impact on the child is very unlikely. So only very few people will. So by the same way against CG, OG are also out in this mechanism. And finally, speak about a self-fulfilling prophecy. We are not sure what is the delta between a person who already has the tendency to develop it in order to develop it before or after. There's if you're going to treatment early, why this is expected trigger that will cause me to develop it? So I don't think that the likelihood of getting early treatment will cause me a self-fulfilling prophecy is very likely when most of those things are going at the likelihood in the first place. For those reasons, our impact wins. Thank you very much.